Hi, everyone. On today's podcast, we're going to talk with Naseema McElroy, a labor and delivery nurse and the founder of Financially Intentional, about her experiences as a labor and delivery nurse and her viral video about representation in healthcare. Welcome to the Evidence-Based Birth Podcast. My name is Rebecca Decker, and I'm a nurse with my PhD and the founder of Evidence-Based Birth. Join me each week as we work together to get evidence-based information into the hands of families and professionals around the world. As a reminder, this information is not medical advice. See evbirth.com/disclaimer for more details. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Decker, pronouns she, her, and I'll be your host for today's episode. Today, we are so excited to talk with Naseema, a labor and delivery nurse and founder of Financially Intentional. Before we interview Naseema, I want to let you know that we will be talking about racism and inequity in the U.S. healthcare system. If there are any other detailed content or trigger warnings, we'll post them in the description or show notes that go along with this episode. And now I'd like to introduce our honored guest. Today, I'm so excited to welcome Naseema McElroy, labor and delivery nurse and founder of Financially Intentional, a personal finance platform normalizing Black wealth. Naseema is the mother of 2 daughters and loves sharing her passion for financial independence and nursing with her followers on Instagram and her podcast, which used to be called Nurses of Fire, now rebranded to the Financially Intentional podcast. We're so excited that Naseema is here. Welcome to the Evidence-Based Birth Podcast.
Hey, Rebecca. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
We love having a fellow podcaster on with us. Can you tell us a little bit, what got you into labor and delivery nursing in the first place so we can kind of get a feel for your backstory?
It's very interesting. I never thought I would be in labor and delivery. I started off in healthcare as an administrator and really hated their bureaucracy. So quit after about 5 years and went back to nursing school. The nursing program that I got into was a master's entry program. So the first year you do your nursing, but when you apply, you have to declare what master's program you want to get into. And I was like, I want to be as general as possible. I want to see as many people as possible. So I chose the F&P program. So once I completed my first year, actually, we were kind of in a recession. That was in 2009. We were in the middle of the big recession, and there weren't a lot of jobs available. But luckily, right before I had went to nursing school, I was working in nursing administration at this one hospital, and so worked with every nurse manager. And so when it was time to get a job, they were like, well, what floor do you want to work on? And I was like, oh, I'll do mom baby because I want to do family. And I think that fits in with family. And so that's how I ended up in perinatal care. I did mom baby for a year, and then I cross-trained to labor and delivery, and I've been a labor and delivery nurse since.
Okay. And what was that first position like, in postpartum and in labor and delivery? Did you enjoy the job? Were there drawbacks or challenges? Like, what was your first year or two like?
Actually, I loved my job so much. It was interesting. I started off at a county hospital, and so I saw a lot of different people. I got to speak Spanish, my labor and delivery Spanish, and it was really great. It was so great and I love labor and delivery so much that I've never even used my F&P.
So you just decided to stay with labor and delivery?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what did you love about it? Like, what were your favorite parts what are your favorite parts of labor and delivery nursing?
For me, it's been the most challenging job, especially those first couple of years. It was a really sharp learning curve, but it's also the most rewarding job. I feel like those memories people never forget. And if you know that you can impact somebody's life in that kind of way, it's a humbling experience, but it's also one of those things that you don't want to take for granted. And so you want to give people the best care possible. And that's what I've committed to do in my career.
It probably goes the same way for you as a new nurse too. Like, I'm sure those first couple of births that you were at, you remember those, clearly.
Yes. Oh, yes. And I remember them because they were like the craziest. I just I got the shoulder dystocias. I got, the amniotic fluid, emboli, and all those kind of like crazy things that kind of just put you into a place where you have to respond, really, really fast and do a lot of critical thinking. And so I was really challenged in my first position, my first couple of years. And I think it made me a stronger nurse.
What did you decide to do next? You said you were there for a couple of years.
I was at the county for a couple of years, and then I just transitioned to a different facility where I work now. I was working both of those jobs and then kind of had to switch up after I had my daughter, and then started working at another facility later. So I had two jobs as a labor and delivery nurse for a while, even while going through nursing school for my FNP.
Did you notice any differences between the facilities? I think it's interesting when you stay at one place your whole career versus when you switch around, you kind of see differences.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. So I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the San Francisco Bay Area is very diverse in a whole lot of ways. So at the county facility, we had a very mixed population. We had a lot of Hispanic patients. Like I said, I got to practice my Spanish and we also had, it's low income. A lot of people access to care there if they don't have insurance. So we had like a volunteer doula program, whereas where I transitioned to, it's like at the tip of Silicon Valley. So we have a lot of engineers, PhDs, people having their babies for the first time in their 40s, just a whole different kind of demographic racially, demographic ethnicity wise. And so just learning different cultures and being exposed to, different groups of people. And then at the other hospital that I worked at, it was kind of like that melting pot of everybody kind of coming together, but kind of in a more like a little bit like lower middle class. So it wasn't, it was like that mix of, we had our really granola, like natural patients. Then we had, our patients who were really, really high risk. So it was a really good mix. But yeah, everywhere I go, the patient population has been very different.
And what about the providers? Were there midwives at all of these facilities or just OBs, or what can you tell us about like the provider culture?
That's a very good question too. So the first place I worked with a lot of residents. So we were a training facility for our family program, and that family program had an OB component. So I worked with a lot of residents, and that was interesting working with residents. And then at the current facility that I work at, it's private practice. And then we have a hospitalist. So it's that, learning all their little, likes and needs, and every doctor is different, and they all treat their patients differently. There's no like real like standards when it comes to, who they see, how they see, and how they practice. So that's different because, private providers are special. And then at the other facility that I worked at, it was again residents, but the way the residents worked, it's really weird. And I think that this is just unique to this medical center period, is that they worked under the midwives. So the midwives didn't practice. So I worked for this hospital organization at two different hospitals. At one before I transferred to the last place I worked, it was midwife care. It was so nice. The midwives took care of the patients. There was always doctors, but the midwives typically saw everybody in labor unless they were super high risk. And then when I transferred to the other facility in relation to that facility, then the midwives did not practice. They did not go to the deliveries. The residents went to all deliveries, and the midwives just oversaw the residency program. It was very interesting, but that place was so busy. The residents had a lot of autonomy, which wasn't necessarily a great thing.
So yeah, they didn't have enough support from the attendings and the midwives.
No, it was crazy. Mm-hmm. It was crazy busy. So yeah, they ran on their own a lot.
You recently had an Instagram video go viral about representation in healthcare. Can you share with our listeners, who have no idea what this video was, what it was about, why you decided to make it, like what triggered this whole experience of sharing this event? Okay,
so I talked about at this facility where I was talking about the residents kind of being rogue, speaking up about the way patients were being treated and basically getting shut down to the point that I eventually got fired, and how I dealt with that process. And it did end up going to litigation. But yeah, that was an eye-opening experience, but I talked about what exactly happened in that process. And it went viral because so many people could relate and so many people had stories. In the comment section, you'll see stories of people with horrific birth, medical experiences, period. I got hundreds if not thousands of emails or DMs of people sharing their experiences with me with the medical system or being treated unfairly at work. And so it was really eye-opening to me.
It's something that is difficult to talk about because I work with a lot of nurses who want to become advocates for better, safer care. And there's always that fear that, well, if I speak up, like, what if they fire me, or what if they make my life miserable because they have the power to do that? What finally made you decide to start raising complaints? Like, what kinds of things were you seeing?
It was almost like there were near misses and sentinel events almost every shift.
Okay. And can you explain what a near miss or a sentinel
Yes.
event is?
A near miss is like something that could have potentially been dangerous to the patient, but for whatever reason, it being caught, or just it didn't end up being something potentially harmful with the patient, like something that could have caused, any kind of damage, any kind of morbidity, any kind of potential death to the mom or the baby. Those things were happening all the time. And then I would see stuff like unnecessary uterine ruptures, unnecessary procedures, unnecessary hysterectomies that could have been avoided because of just negligence. And I spoke up. I'm a very verbal person, but the thing about that unique hospital was the management changed hands frequently. I was literally only there from like November to May. And in that time, I think we had 7 different managers, 2 different directors. And so the nursing leadership wasn't there to have a continuous voice for the nurses. And so I went to the chief OB and I was like, hey, these are some things in the true espar. Like, this is what I'm seeing. This is why I believe is happening here. And this is like my recommendation on what needs to happen, because this should not be happening. Like, we're all experienced nurses here, but there is something that needs some retraining that needs to go on. And she basically shut me down. I was like, nah, I just think that you're the problem. And I was like, okay, well, I see, how this is going to be. Like I said, I came from a hospital administration background. I used to work in compliance. Like, I know how it goes down. So I'm just like, so we're just going to have to go a different route about handling the situation, So that's the way I took it. Like, I went through the powers that be to try to resolve the situation. But like I said, because there was a lack of consistency and the management and all those kind of things, instead of, my concerns being, taken seriously, it ended up in my termination. And to speak to, people being scared to speak up for fear of loss of job, well, that's exactly what my platform is about, because I really feel like it's our obligation as nurses to be true patient advocates, to be in a financial position where we're not beholden to these organizations, because that's when we really can't be in our true advocacy role. Our roles as nurses is to be the advocate. We spend a lot of the most time, especially in labor and delivery, with the patients. Like, we're sometimes their only voice. And so I was at a personal position where right before that, I had paid off $1 million in debt, and I was, financially secure. But I had another job as well. And so I didn't feel beholden to this organization to the point where I didn't feel like I needed to speak up. I didn't think I was going to get terminated. No way, no how, especially in Northern California where we have a heavy union presence. So I didn't even think that was possible, but I also was not in fear of doing that.
So your financial independence and the fact that you had options meant that you could be fearless when it came to using your voice.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And also just my background and knowing that, this was not supposed to happen, and that they're supposed to have root cause analyses. And they're actually, when somebody raises a concern at this level, there's processes. And this medical center was just so disorganized. Like, those things just never happened. Mm-hmm. And if I didn't speak up, who was going to speak up? Because nothing was going to change.
It makes me think of like new graduate nurses and midwives, and how you already had some experience. Plus, you'd gone back to school for this degree after you'd already worked. So you had more life experience, and I think confidence to use your voice when you saw things. But I think of like new graduates who may be feeling more timid. What advice do you have for them when they're if they find themselves in a workplace that's unsafe like this and disorganized and chaotic?
You have to recognize a lot of times we internalize things like this because it's not necessarily that obvious from the beginning. It's a lot of things that you're just like, wait a minute. Especially if you're new to practice, right? You're like, this doesn't seem right. I don't think this is done right. I see these patients not being treated fair, or whatever you're feeling. First, trust those feelings. Because especially if we don't know better, or if we think that we're not the experts in something, we say, well, maybe it's just because I need to learn and grow a little bit more. Trust those feelings. Because a lot of things are intuition, or a lot of things are just outside of your medical experience. This is just like, these are like basic human rights that aren't being attended to, right? And those things. It doesn't matter how much clinical training you have. If you know that somebody's basic human rights are being violated, you need to say something. But it's hard to speak up because it's hard to know who you can trust. Because as a new grad, you're in a position where you can be terminated for any reason. If you're seen as a troublemaker, chances are you're going to lose your job. Two things I would say. If you know that there's somebody there like me that's not scared to speak up on your behalf, those are the people that you need to confide in. If you don't feel like there's that person, you can always go to HR and file a complaint. Don't be afraid to do that. The other thing that I feel like a lot of people don't do and that they should do is kind of seek legal advice as early as possible, especially as a new grad. Like, you're scared to rock the boat, but sometimes to protect yourself, you need to seek legal advice, and not like to the point where you're suing, but to the point where this is somebody that you could CC in an email that you're sharing. And I always say, if there's something happening, document it. And you document it, like I said, very like espar, like you tell the situation, you tell the background, you tell your assessment, and what you would recommend and what your understanding of that situation is and what you feel needs to happen. And then you ask in that email for them to respond to you, because at the end of the day, it's all about providing safe patient care. And that's what this is about. Mm-hmm. And if those things are documented, chances are you'll be protected. And if you aren't protected, then you have something to fall back on if things were to go awry. Like if you were to get fired, you have that, like, hey, I brought this to their attention. This is obviously, some kind of neglect or mistreatment that's going on. And they did not address it. Not only did they address it, now I'm being terminated. And there's laws to protect you against that.
And you mentioned espar a couple times, so I want to make sure our listeners who aren't nurses know what that means. But it started being used 10 or 15 years ago in nursing, and it was actually adopted, I believe, from the military in terms of nuclear communication. Like when you're talking about sensitive subjects, you use this espar approach, which you already kind of defined, and it's a way to get your point across calmly, and so that hopefully other people can hear it and receive that comment. And often it's used for communication between different disciplines, where you're talking, maybe a nurse is talking with a doctor, where they come from different backgrounds and different value systems. And it's a way to connect with each other.
Yeah. Also, we use it in emergency situations to clearly get the point across and to succinctly tell what's going on, so we can all kind of be on the same level. Like if we're going into a C-section, or if, somebody's having a hemorrhage, and you just give a quick situation background assessment and recommendation on what's going on, so that, everybody's aware in the room.
So it stands for S is what's the situation, B, what's background,
background, assessment,
and
then
R.
R is your recommendation.
We've talked about this at EBB. This is a great tool for doulas and other professionals to use as well when they're trying to get information across that's important. It was so important that when I used to teach nursing, we actually had on the back of our students' badges. So like a little reminder. Because communication is really key when you're talking about safety.
Communication is the center of safety. I mean, like, imagine somebody's coming into the room thinking it's one thing when it's not, especially in labor and delivery where there's so many different variables, because somebody can come in the room and think maybe it's a decel that everybody is rushing in here, but no, mommy is like bleeding out or something like that, and so it's a whole different situation than they thought it was. And there's going to be a whole different course of action. So if they're going about it one way, and somebody else, and then there is just too many variables and too much room for things to go wrong in those situations where things aren't clear.
So you talked about trusting yourself, having options, seeking legal advice, and documenting everything that happened. Can you talk a little bit about like going up the chain of command? Because you talked about, you knew you didn't have a manager who would back you up. So you kind of just went to the chief OB thinking that they would listen. Like what are other people you can go to talk to if you're having safety concerns about a hospital?
So, the chain of command is always going to be your charge nurse. We have assistant nurse managers here, then to your manager, your director. Then there's going to be the chief nursing officer or the house supervisor, chief nursing officer. That's internal to a hospital that you would go up that chain of command. Typically, that's the structure.
The problems you were seeing, though, were related to the residents, not the nurses.
It was the doctors, but it was also the nurses too. It was also the nurses. And the reason why I went to her is because she was the constant, right? It wasn't because I felt like she could affect the nurses. I mean, but it was because I felt she had a voice in, the management. And so she could talk to the nursing manager, whoever it was at the time, to kind of come on board, because you have to have both components. And I think it was more of just like a communication. It was a lot of communication issues between the nurses and the residents, but it was also like some procedural things on both sides that weren't happening. Yeah, I went to her because number one, it was a lot of issues that were affecting Black women specifically. And she was a Black woman. And I was like, hey, like, I feel like maybe you can relate, but she couldn't. And then two, she was the constant.
We talk a lot at EBB in our trainings with instructors and others just about, people who are resistant to change or, defensive when they're presented with feedback. Did you get feelings that, was there burnout or was there just defensiveness or, what are some of like the underlying reasons why someone would be resistant to your feedback if you're coming to them with safety concerns?
I think she was just set in her ways and she felt like I was beneath her. And how dare I come to her and talk to her about issues? And I just really felt like it was like that. It's like that traditional like nurse doctor structure, which I had never experienced because I've always looked at doctors as colleagues. I've never, I work with nurses who are always just like, oh my God, like scared to talk to the doctors. I've never had that before. And I never had that with her directly because I felt like I've been able to talk to her directly about other things. But in that situation, when things were questioned, and because this was her department and I was questioning, and I kind of looked like an outsider coming in because I was newer at that facility, she like, well, who are you to question me? I'm just like, okay. She was like, I know you're a really good nurse. And I was surprised, and I'm surprised that you're coming to me like that, like this. And I'm just like, yeah, but you don't know who I am in totality. And so I can understand why you think that you can talk to me crazy, but it's not going to happen. And that's what, because that's probably what has been going on. If you're used to talking down to people and nobody ever saying anything to you, if you're used to running your department, however you want to run it and nobody questioning it, when somebody questions it, obviously you're going to be defensive and you're going to be like, well, who are you to question this? And that's exactly the vibe I got.
It's one of those things where it can be really, really difficult, if not impossible, to make change if you have someone in a position of power who is not willing to support those changes.
And I could see how anybody else in that situation could have felt really, really intimidated. But that's just not my spirit.
It wasn't you.
So I was like just like this, just laughing like, oh, okay, so she don't even know who she's talking to. So, okay, I see I'm going to just have to go about this a different way. And that's what I did. She's no longer there.
Yeah. So what'd you do next?
I went to, I can't think of what it's called right now. It's an initial. It's like EB employee. I can't think of what it is. And if I do, but anyway, I went there and I went there because I kind of needed to flush everything out and then kind of come up with a systemic approach. And they're therapists. So they help you kind of like process things, right? So, and it's a protected space. So I went there, I told them what the issues were, and I told them what I thought the course of action should be. And they also told me what the courses of action should be. And so their therapist too is like, you know what, you're experiencing a lot of trauma, so you need to take care of you as well as, go about, trying to get these issues addressed. And so in taking care of me, it meant, going to the mental health department or psychology and getting assessed for trauma. Like it was definitely trauma that I was going through.
Because you were witnessing a lot of what we would call obstetric violence or these near misses. Oh, yes. Yeah. People losing their uteruses, that sort of thing is very traumatic to witness.
It's traumatic. And I'm one of those kind of people that thrive in a sense of like urgency and like when emergencies happen, like that's kind of my jam. But I would find myself going to work, crying in the parking lot before I would go in there just because it was just so much. And I was scared that something would happen to my patient or that I would be pulled into something where I would lose my license. It was terrifying. But yeah, so, I went to mental health and they were just like, oh, we have to refer you out. Like, this is like crazy. And I'm going to speak to the unique nature of the organization that I work for is that, it's the hospital, but it's also where my health insurance was.
Oh, so a lot of hospitals, for people to understand this, have their own health insurance companies. Mm-hmm. So you get your healthcare through the hospital system, and unless you purchase like a really expensive insurance that lets you go elsewhere, correct?
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. So, I was being seen, like even my OB, I worked side by side with her, so, but it's also my insurance. So my insurance, my healthcare provider, and also the medical group. And so they were just like, so I was doing stepwise what they told me. I went to mental health. I got my therapy taken care of. My therapist was like, this is trauma. They need to take you off of work for a little while. And that involved going through a process where then I had to go to employee health and get evaluated by them. Then they said I had to do a workman's comp thing. Then I had to do like all these things. So I was jumping through all these hoops. And then I wasn't being heard as a patient. So then I became the patient that wasn't being advocated for. And then on the other side, I had to go through HR again, but in a different capacity, and then corporate compliance in order to file the complaints that I was seeing. And so things were being taken care of on both sides, but it was crazy.
It sounds crazy. Like a big car accident that just keeps happening.
It turned into a big issue where, like I said, instead of me being able to advocate for those patients, I was then the patient that wasn't being advocated for. And I was being, kind of put through the grinder. Like, why am I filing a workman's comp lawsuit? Like, I need to, I need to get these issues addressed. Yeah, I'm seeking my help, but yeah, I do need to take time off to recover. And so it got to a point where HR was like, we recommend that your manager gives you time off. So I had an outside therapist who told me you need to be off, but then they send you to another internal therapist that's a psychologist that's supposed to oversee all these things. And she was like, well, it looks like this is a traumatic situation and I can only treat you for PTSD. And since you're in that situation, I can't really treat you and I can't really give any recommendations. I was like, so you're acknowledging that this is trauma that's going on, but so you're saying you don't want to do anything about it? Well, I can't really do anything about it. All I can do is ask your boss to voluntarily give you time off. And I'm like, what? So all those things happened, wrote a letter to my manager, was like, hey, this is what's going on, and these are their recommendations. He was like, oh, I can't give you time off because of staffing. I said, okay, that's not how that works. And so that's kind of like the ripple that kind of started the lawsuit, and then eventually, the ripple that caused me to eventually get fired, and then lawsuit and all that kind of stuff.
When all they really needed to do was stop creating unnecessary trauma for their patients, and you would have felt safer at work, and you could have addressed the trauma you experienced, but instead you were stuck in this traumatizing situation.
Exactly. Being re-traumatized. And that's the whole thing about like these bureaucracies. And actually, that's the reason why I got out of healthcare administration is it's like at the end of the day, it no longer is about the patient. It's about the system. It's just sad. It's just a sad cycle that we're trapped in. And that's why I feel like these issues around Black mortality and morbidity, are like not going to be resolved unless we have a whole big system shakeup.
Can you talk a little bit then about, the work that you became passionate about, like sharing info for nurses and other healthcare workers to become financially independent so that they can feel like they can speak up and use their voice? Can you talk a little bit about like what are some of the strategies you're teaching, or like what are people coming to learn from you about?
Yeah. So what I learned in my own financial independence journey, and this was not intentional, it was just, I knew that I was at the point in my life where I needed to do better with my finances. And as a side result, I discovered how taking control of my finances gave me so much control back over my life. And I wanted that for everybody. And like I said, that empowerment was what gave me no fear about speaking up. And I wanted every nurse to have that empowerment because I have had nurses tell me, I can't do that. I'm scared I'm going to lose my job. And I'm just like, that should not be a thing. You should be able to show up at work wholly as a nurse. You should know what your options are. And if you know that you have exhausted everything in that organization, you should have enough money to be able to say F you. And that's literally what it's called, like F you money, and walk away. Because I think like we're in the unique position as nurses to be able to move around. I know it's like it's in the Bay Area. Like if you are an experienced nurse, you are a gold mine to these organizations. Like everybody wants you. Like there is no lack of jobs. And as a nurse, there's no lack of things that you can do. I can be a nurse and work at a tech company. I was a nurse consulting at a bank. Like there's so many different options, but you have to be open to those options and you have to know what's possible. So the focus of Nurses on Fire was really to show nurses what's possible with examples of nurses who are currently doing the things, nurses who have left troubling situations and have gone on to build companies, are like gone up the ladder in med pharma in the industry, and they've done things differently. Nurses who have retired early, nurses who, just work when they want to work. So they shift that dynamic between the hospitals and the nurses, because you're only showing up to work because you want to be there and not because you need to be there. And you show up wholly as a different person. But I can't tell you how many people don't even know that that's a possibility. And financial independence changes the narrative around work, period. Work becomes like not your life. Like in America, your career is like your life. You spend so much time in your career. In the financial independence community, work is an ends to a means. Work is a way to get you to the place where you don't have to depend on a paycheck in order to live and to be able to live the life and to impact the way that you want to impact. And so it just opened up a world of possibility for nurses, and giving them solid examples. It's nothing like is nothing like just made up or fictitious or fantasized. It's actual people living this way. And I brought on a whole scope of people. So a whole like different people from different backgrounds, but all nurses who are out here doing things differently.
It does make a difference that just even that basic safety net of knowing like I could walk out of here and I'd be okay. And I'll be able to find something else I love doing. And I imagine that you saw even more of this during the pandemic.
The pandemic was a crazy time. It was a crazy time because it was just a lot of uncertainty. And you could tell how inequities kind of played a role in that. And, in labor and delivery, a lot of people lean on their family for support. And then when you see that sometimes you can have your care provider there, if they're not COVID positive, it leads to a lot of patients like feeling isolated and alone. And then for like nurses, it was again, the uncertainty, being put in situations where you're risking your life, but not even sure if you have the proper PPE. Like, I do surgery. We wear masks all the time. And, like the thought of having to reuse a mask is like, what? Like, why are we doing this again? Like, and it just like it caused this ripple effect where people didn't even feel like being a nurse was worth it. I mean, and that's like where we're seeing this great resignation in nursing. And yeah, I saw that it wasn't where I work in. It wasn't so bad just because of the unique nature of the hospital, and they really tried to take care of us. But I saw it all around me, and the people that, I represent in the nursing community are the people that I interact with in the nursing community. And it's pretty sad. People are really like not feeling nursing right now.
Which is really sad because, like you said earlier, nursing as a field, there's just so many possibilities within it. And like, I know myself, I'm not hospital nursing and I haven't for years. I guess I could if I really needed to, but I instead go every Friday to a high school for pregnant teens and work with them, like doing that kind of like community health education. And like, that is what, drives me and gives me, I don't know, that good feeling about what I'm doing. So you don't have to necessarily be at the bedside in the hospital. And sometimes people think if I'm not doing that, I'm not a nurse, but there's all different ways of nursing. And for some people that is their jam. Like they love being in the hospital. For me, I get overstimulated really easily. It was just not the right environment for me.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. That's why I work night shift.
Maybe I should have done nights, but
nights is like physically taxing. So, you kind of just like, have to weigh what's good for you. And that's the whole thing. There's so many options. And like, instead of people exiting nursing, like they should find different ways that works for them. But that's another thing. People don't know what's possible. Mm-hmm. It's like you're the average of the people that you're surrounded with. If you've only seen things done a certain way, that's all you know. If you only know nurses as being at the bedside, then that's all you know. And so, that's why I felt it was important to have this platform because nurses need to know what's possible.
Mm-hmm. You had one other video go viral that was quite entertaining and also sad and scary. Can you explain that situation? And people can find it on your Instagram page, but I just would love to hear like your story for our listeners.
Yeah, so that happened my first year of nursing. And I really thought like I was being punked, like this can't be real, right? So I go to work and I'm getting report from the off-going nurse. And she goes, oh, yeah, I had to put a psych consult on this patient. I'm like, okay, yeah, what happened? Why a psych consult? And that's not normal in our department.
Psych meaning like psychiatric doctors need to come see this patient?
Right. Like they need to follow up with her. They need to see her. And I'm just like, oh, what happened? And she was like, well, every time I went in the room, she was hitting herself on the head. And I was like, what? And then I like step back and like, so I have to give you the demographics of this hospital. So this hospital, because it's a county hospital, like I said, we have a large Hispanic population. We had like Black patients like every once in a while, not as often as other patients. I would say maybe like 10% of the time, right? And this nurse was Filipino, trained in the Philippines and, had primarily worked at this hospital in the States. And I was like, she was hitting herself on the head. I was like, oh, what's she doing like this? And I started patting my head. And she was like, oh my God, yeah, how did you know? I said, is she Black? And she was like, yeah, how did you know? I said, well, when Black people can't get to their scalp or they don't want to mess up their hair or, whatever, this is how we scratch our head. And then she was like, oh, I didn't know that. I was like, okay, I'll go ahead and take that psych consult off. But then I was like, oh, I thought that she was joking at first. I was like, you for real have never seen this. And then she was like, no, I did not know. And then so I asked the other nurses at the nursing station, and I was like, you guys know what this means, right? And they're like, no. And I'm just like, okay. So I did my whole little lesson there. But in that situation, because this is a county hospital and because the way they do things, say she would have got a psych consult, right? And oftentimes, just like this nurse, people don't do their full assessment and they'll take the nurse's word for it. And then the psych person might have just came in the room, saw her holding her baby and hitting herself on the head and being like, oh yeah, there's something wrong. Now social work is called. Now this person may lose her baby because, they think she's a danger to herself. And if she's a danger to herself, who's going to protect this little baby? And not only that, now she has whatever psychiatric diagnosis they're going to put on her chart, which follows her, which then affects her care for something seemingly benign. And then you see kind of how these incidences, and they don't just happen in isolation, they are often compounded because of lack of diversity and because lack of implicit bias and all of these kind of things that happen. They compound to people getting poor care, which leads to poor patient outcomes, which leads to family separation, which leads to all different kind of things because you didn't take the time to do a full assessment, because you didn't take the time to just understand, and because you did not have anyone around you to educate you, to tell you, hey, this is normal, because you work in a silo.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that story so other people can learn. I think it's probably the most bizarre, but it's a really potent example of how the systemic racism that leads to lack of representation has real impacts on families. And we really appreciate, Naseema, you using your voice and your courage to help us address this kind of racism in maternity care.
Yeah. I mean, and that was another one that, people started sharing their stories. And even though, like I said, these little benign things turn into serious issues. So people finally felt like, oh, somebody understands. Yeah, here's a place where I can share. But it's just like these things aren't addressed systemically. And so there's not any big changes. I mean, we can talk amongst ourselves about it as much as we want to, but it was really to bring these things to a forefront. And, luckily because of my platform, it did get media attention, and it did get on eyes where I feel maybe there can be some things that can impact true patient care. And I'm not going to stop talking about it. It's my passion as well, but it all ties into financial independence. It's all about, and the thing, that's why I talk about normalizing wealth for Black people, because when you have access to wealth, you have access to more resources. And even if you have all the resources, you still have to know what's possible for you. I mean, because look at Serena Williams, resources don't protect you from experiencing these things, but they give you an outlet to have a voice, and they give you an outlet to engage people like attorneys, or to understand what options you have to go up that chain of command, speak up until these issues are addressed. Because if these issues are addressed for you, they can impact change for other people.
Well, thank you, Naseema, for being a true change agent and for following your passion and educating us. How can our listeners follow you and your work? Do you have any projects coming up you want to let us know about?
Yeah, so I am at Financially Intentional on Instagram. Again, building wealth is my passion. And so I have a course that I teach on, everything from budgeting, investing to legacy building. And I have information on how to access that, but also just a free guide on how to get started on building wealth. And I have that in my link in bio on my Instagram page for people. So, just go to financiallyintentional.com, check out my link in bio, and I have a lot of resources there. But also just follow me, because I give out a lot of just a free game about, building wealth, about being an advocate for yourself and for your patients all the time, every day of the week.
Thank you, Naseema. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your story, and for all of the education you do on the internet streets, on Instagram.
Yes.
And for keeping all of us informed.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate you.
Today's podcast was brought to you by the Evidence-Based Birth Professional Membership. The free articles and podcasts we provide to the public are supported by our professional membership program at Evidence-Based Birth. Our members are professionals in the childbirth field who are committed to being change agents in their community. Professional members at EBB get access to continuing education courses with up to 23 contact hours, live monthly training sessions, an exclusive library of printer-friendly PDFs to share with your clients, and a supportive community for asking questions and sharing challenges, struggles, and success stories. We offer monthly and annual plans, as well as scholarships for students and for people of color. To learn more, visit ebbirth.com/membership.